Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of The Breakdown of Capitalism, a History of the Idea in Western Marxism, 1883 to 1983. Chapter 5 is titled Come on, you son of a gun. Breakdown Theory on the American Marxists, the Theoretical Spectrum of the Early Years, with the headings Resistance to Revisionism, Anti-Orthodox Beginnings, Neo-orthodoxy in the Second Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. All right, let's rock. Well, actually, let's not. God damn it. What a terrible start to a video. You guys think I can redeem it? Alright. Chapter 5, Breakdown Theory and the American Marxists, the Theoretical Spectrum of the Early Years. The crisis and breakdown were foreseen by Karl Marx. His foresight was dismissed as the mere wish fulfillment of his revolutionary purposes. Now it has been verified by life itself. Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. Quote, whatever approves itself to us on any grounds at the outset, presently comes to appeal to us as a gratifying thing in itself. It comes to rest in our habits of thought as substantially right. End quote. Thorstein Veblen, Theory of the Leisure Class. Quote, the things themselves, which only the limited brains of men and animals believe fixed and stationary, have no real existence at all. They are the flashing and sparks of a drawn sword, the glow of victory in the conflict of opposing qualities. End quote. Nietzsche, Philosophy in the Age of the Greeks. The American theorists who contemplated the end of capitalism during the first decades of the 20th century were confronted by an expanding body of European interpretations and by heightened perceptions of a changing capitalist reality. The revisionist debates and the orthodox defense in Europe, the continued monopolization of capital, and the rise of imperialism all combined to form an explosive context for the American theorists as they viewed the text of Marx's Capital. The three theorists studied in this chapter, Thorstein Veblen, Louis Boudin, and Louis Corey, represent three very different attempts to measure Marx's thought against the theoretical demands of a seemingly new social order. Wikipedia says Louis B. Boudin lived from 1874 to 1952 and was a Russian-born American Marxist theoretician, writer, politician, and lawyer. He is best remembered as the author of a 2-volume history of the Supreme Court's influence on American government, first published in 1932. And Louis C. Freina, who lived from 1892 to 1953, was an Italian-American writer, educator, and theoretician who was a founding member of the Communist Party of America in 1919. After running afoul of the Communist International in 1921 over the alleged misappropriation of funds, Freina left the organized radical movement, emerging in 1926 as a left-wing public intellectual by the name of Louis Corey. During the McCarthy era, deportation proceedings were initiated against Freina Corey. After a protracted legal battle, Corey died of a cerebral hemorrhage before the action against him was formally abandoned. Back to the text. Although these three theorists responded to a common set of concerns and conditions, their perspectives and positions differed considerably. Veblen, a philosopher by training, pursued his studies of capitalism from a position that more closely resembled the academic setting of the Frankfurt Scholars than the revolutionary world of the Neo-orthodox theorists. Although Veblen was never fully integrated into the American university system, Veblen remained even more distant from the political organizations and movements of his time. Boudin, by contrast, was a practicing attorney throughout the period when his theoretical efforts were consolidated and assumed a leadership role in the American Socialist Party. He was immersed in the practical affairs of everyday life and in the radical politics of the early socialist drive. Corey, however, did not share Veblen's ties to the academic world or Boudin's entanglements in the complexities of the bourgeois legal system, but was a professional revolutionary, with little or no connection to the larger society until relatively late in his life. Corey lived out a practical commitment that eventually evaded his theoretical understanding. Despite these differences of training and purpose, however, these three theorists were linked by their common interest in the fate of capitalism, their common perception of a changing social order, and their common use of Marx as a reference point in their attempts to comprehend economic developments. The works of these three theorists appeared at a time when Marx's influence was first felt with full force in the United States. Their writings should be placed in that context. It was also a time, however, when perceptions of a changing capitalist reality were first articulated and the revisionist controversies set the terms of the debate. Marx's thought was simultaneously appropriate and subjected to modification. No full assimilation of the original text occurred with the assumption of their complete and immediate applicability. Initial readings were already marked by a revisionist eye. Like the European theorists of the same era, the American theorists were writing at a point when the disjuncture of Marx's text and the context of capitalist development seemed to be well established for a significant group of writers with a particular political agenda. There is no movement in the development of American Marxist theory during this early period. There is no linear movement in the development of American Marxist theory during this period. Nothing that might resemble what has been construed as a progression from orthodoxy to anti-orthodoxy in the European experience. Footnote. See, for example, Martin J., The Dialectical Imagination, A History of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, and Perry Anderson's book, Considerations on Western Marxism. End footnote. Instead, there is a much more complex diffusion of concepts of breakdown, one that does not easily fit traditional models of conceptual change. Anti-orthodox concepts appeared at an early point in the intellectual history of American Marxism, but remain subordinated to the uneasy but entrenched orthodox and neo-orthodox positions. Boudin, who openly struggled to reconstruct an orthodox theory in the face of the revisionist challenge, inadvertently moved into a confused amalgamation of the discourses of Marx's Capital, forcing together empirical and general modes of analysis and silencing the undeterministic and anti-positivist theoretical position of Marx's work on profit rates. Veblen, who placed himself outside the Marxist camp and made a deliberate effort to rewrite Marx in conjunction with a perceived change in the economic order, produced texts that anticipated the anti-orthodox position of the Frankfurt theorists. Veblen's work was never fully assimilated by the neo-orthodox theorists, despite his duplication of many of Marx's basic concepts. Corey, whose claims of allegiance to Marx were unequivocal, eventually fell into an apocalyptic determinism that resonates most clearly with the general statements on contradiction in Marx's Capital, and yet relies on the elaborate analysis of profit rates found in Volume 3 for theoretical support. The result of the works of these three American writers is an expansion of the range of theoretical possibilities generated by the concept of breakdown. The expansion duplicates the European experience at certain points and defies it at others, simultaneously affirming and defeating European perceptions of historical change and the theoretical adjustments that followed. In the works of the early American Marxist theorists, the history of the theories of breakdown is played out in a series of duplications and exaggerations, magnifications and retractions, repetitions and differences. The original texts of Marx are shattered and scattered in a discourse that strains to capture change itself. New section. Resistance to revisionism. Although Victor Berger and the Wisconsin socialists adopted Bernstein's interpretation of the Great Depression and recovery and openly accepted the revisionist label, most readers in the American Socialist Party at the turn of the century believed that socialism in the United States and Europe was imminent. Wikipedia says Victor L. Berger lived from 1860 to 1929. Victor Berger was an Austrian-American socialist politician and journalist who was a founding member of the Social Democratic Party of America and its successor, the Socialist Party of America. Born in the Austrian Empire, present-day Romania, Berger immigrated to the United States as a young man and became an important and influential socialist journalist in Wisconsin. Victor Berger helped establish the so-called sewer socialist movement and also sparked the American Socialist Party's nativist turn. In 1910, he was elected as the first socialist to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing a district in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In 1919, Berger was convicted of violating the Espionage Act of 1917 for publishing his anti-interventionist views and was denied the seat to which he had been re-elected in the House of Representatives. The criminal verdict was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court in 1921 in Berger v. the United States. Berger was subsequently elected to 3 successive terms in the 1920s, for which he was seated. Wikipedia says sewer socialism refers to the American socialist movement that centered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin from around 1892 to 1960. The moniker was coined by Morris Hillquit at the 1932 Milwaukee Convention of the Socialist Party of America as a commentary on the Milwaukee Socialists and the perpetual boasting about the excellent public sewer system in the city. Back to the text. Although Victor Berger and the Wisconsin socialists adopted Bernstein's interpretations of the First Great Depression and recovery and openly accepted the revisionist label, most leaders in the American Socialist Party at the turn of the century believed that socialism in the United States and Europe was imminent. With the rise of trust and the rapid increase in the size of the industrial proletariat, many American Marxist theorists thought that capitalism in the United States was already deep in decline and might soon move into the final stages of collapse. Footnote. See generally G.D.H. Cole, A History of Socialist Thought, Volume 3, The Second International, Part 2. See also A. Creditor's book, The Radical Persuasion, 1890 to 1917, Aspects of the Intellectual History and the Historiography of 3 American Radical Organizations, published in 1981. End footnote. When the revisionist assault spread from Europe to the United States, Louis Boudin, the chief theoretician for the American Socialist Party, quickly issued a response. Boudin was born in Russia, but emigrated to the United States at an early age. He is one of the founders of the radical faction of the Socialist Party and a key contributor to New Review and The Class Struggle. Footnote. The best source of bibliographical information on Boudin is Theodore Draper's The Roots of American Communism, published in 1957. For an introduction to Boudin's theoretical work, see Paul Sweezy. The Influence of Marxist Economics on American Thought and Practice, published in, it's kind of blurry, the screen here, Socialism in American Life, published in 1952. End footnote. Boudin's book, The Theoretical System of Karl Marx, in the Light of Recent Criticism, was published in 1907 in response to the revisionist debates of the Second International. Footnote. See Louis Boudin, The Theoretical System of Karl Marx in the Light of Recent Criticism. The book originally appeared in a 1905 to 1906 as a series of articles in the journal International Socialist Review, a periodical that served the Marxists and syndicalists of the Socialist Party in the United States. The book, Theoretical Systems, was translated into German and Russian soon after it appeared in book form. With Theoretical System, Louis Boudin's position as the chief theoretician of the Socialist Party was solidified, and he became an internationally known Marxist writer. Luxemburg cites Boudin's, quote, brilliant review, unquote, of Tugendbaranovsky. See Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital. Lenin was familiar with Boudin's work and included Theoretical Systems in his 1914 bibliography of Marxism. One of the most striking features of Theoretical System is its detailed dialogue with the European and Russian Marxist theorists of the revisionist era. Boudin was fluent in German and Russian and had access to the foreign language press and to the German editions of Marx's writing. He was familiar with the works of the classical political economists, with Marx's early works and all 3 volumes of Capital, and with the voluminous reports emerging from the revisionist controversy. Boudin was in full command of the works of Bumbaverk, Bernstein, Kautsky, and Tugendbaranovsky. Few other Marxists have written from such a complete knowledge of their European counterparts. Boudin's explicit purpose in Theoretical System is to reestablish an orthodox reading of Marx's Capital in the face of the revisionist onslaught. Theoretical System, the book, is marked by a polemical and defensive style. Throughout, Boudin relies on a reading of Marx that demands complete consistency and coherence from Marx's Capital. Conceptual variations and divergent styles within the original text are flattened in the commentary, as Boudin increasingly sacrifices the logic of his own position for a forced clarity in the reading of Marx. The highest level of confusion and fragmentation in Boudin's work occurs in those portions of the text that attempt to circumscribe and limit the range of theoretical possibilities arising from Marx's theory of capitalist development. Boudin begins the book, Theoretical System, with a long and detailed defense of the labor theory of value against the charges leveled by the marginalists. Boudin then moves into a discussion of surplus value in Marx's chapters on profit, where Marxist theory scores its, quote, greatest triumph, unquote. Boudin approaches the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as the pivotal point in Marx's understanding of the contradictions of capitalism. At this point in Theoretical System, Boudin's reading of Marx begins to falter. In his discussion of the falling rate of profit, Boudin loses sight of the complexity of Marx's Capital and forces an argument that is not sustained by Marx's writings in Volume 3. In an attempt to answer the revisionist, Boudin determines that he will present the law of the falling rate of profit in the context of, quote, the actual facts of capitalist production, end quote, rather than discuss the, quote, tendency in its purity, end quote. Boudin. Although Marx holds the rate of surplus value constant throughout his formulation of the tendency towards a falling rate of profit, the, quote, actual facts, end quote, of capitalism lead Boudin to associate a fall in the rate of profit with a rise in the rate of surplus value, and to adopt these two movements as the manifestations of the, quote, cross tendencies, end quote, at work in profit rates. This is a fundamental misreading of Marx's theory, and one that appears all the more striking due to Boudin's claim that his work, quote, is merely intended to present the Marxian theory as stated by Marx, end quote. Boudin. With a rise in the rate of surplus value rather than a rise in the mass of profit posed as the counter-tendency to the falling rate of profit, Boudin denies the effect of the counter-tendency and discounts its ability to slow the falling rate of profit. Although Boudin acknowledges the increase in the mass of profits as a movement which accompanies a decrease in the rate, he does not acknowledge the increase as the effective counter-tendency that Marx posed as an offsetting force in the law. This failure to acknowledge the central counter-tendency leads Boudin to reformulate the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as an absolute and inevitable law, rather than the tendential movement that Marx described with great qualification in Volume 3 of Capital. In the book Theoretical System, Marx's only full theoretical elaboration of the contradictions of capitalism is given a deterministic and mechanistic voice, and linked to the general statements on contradiction. Subsequently, the open dialectic of effect and counter-effect is irrevocably lost in Boudin's interpretation of profit rates. With the law of the falling rate of profit firmly established as an absolute movement towards the collapse of capitalism, Boudin does not pursue the significance of this movement or present the predictions that logically follow from his position. Instead, he abruptly shifts into a detailed and faithful discussion of average rates of profit in an attempt to refute the revisionist argument that posed a contradiction between the concepts of value utilized in capital. When the discussion of the fate of capitalism reemerges in the next chapter, the law of the falling rate of profit is mentioned only in the context of the higher organic composition of capital and its role in the creation of a reserve army of workers. Without a glance back to Volume 3 and the discourse surrounding the discussion of profits, Boudin turns to the popular passages of Volume 1, where the general statements on contradiction are combined with the statements on a proletariat revolution. At this point, Boudin's discussion of the contradictions of capitalism become largely rhetorical, and his conception of breakdown becomes an unwitting confusion of what he describes as, quote, economic and, quote, moral categories emerging of distinct and, according to Boudin, incompatible discourses. The theoretical power of Capital Volume 3, with its postulation of tendencies and counter-tendencies, is suddenly and completely replaced by the predictive position of Marx's general statements on contradiction. What follows is a confused argument that predicts the absolute and automatic breakdown of the capitalist system. Boudin argues that that collapse is already underway, but will eventually take one of three forms. First, Boudin argues that a purely mechanical collapse will occur as the inevitable consequence of the irredeemable development of the contradictions stemming from centralization and concentration, and properly understood as an entirely economic problem. Then Boudin goes on to argue that these contradictions produce, quote, sociological, unquote, conditions such as increased unemployment and exploitation, which will force a, quote, moral imperative to revolt among the members of the working class. Finally, Boudin argues that a fatal underconsumption crisis will occur before the full development of economic contradictions brings about mechanical breakdown. With this assortment of causes for the inevitable breakdown of capitalism enumerated, Boudin then fills the rest of the theoretical system with arguments that qualify and ultimately retract his claims. Working from Capital Volume 1, Boudin contends that a mode of production can only continue as long as it, quote, does not hinder the unfolding and full exploitation of the productive forces of society, end quote. Boudin. According to Boudin, the concentration and centralization of capital, which occur as an unavoidable result of the process of capital accumulation, constitutes a set of fetters on the mode of production and provide the necessary and sufficient cause for the collapse of the capitalist system. Quote, if this process should be permitted freely to work out its tendencies, unquote, towards accumulation, concentration, and centralization, Boudin argues the concentration of wealth would become so great that the economic system could not continue to function. The, quote, purely economico-mechanical existence, unquote, of capitalism, quote, is put in jeopardy by the laws of its own development, end quote. Boudin. But this development, which leads to mechanical collapse, Boudin claims, may be, quote, arrested by the, quote, sociological results, end quote, to which the process of concentration and centralization, quote, must inevitably lead, end quote. The, quote, sociological expression, end quote, of the, quote, mechanical law of accumulation, end quote, is the, quote, capitalistic law of relative overpopulation, end quote, which leads to the creation of a new reserve army of workers and increased exploitation of the proletariat. These, quote, sociological conditions, unquote, generate dissatisfaction with the capitalist system in a large sector of the population. The revolutionary response to oppressive conditions is a, quote, moral, end quote, response, which arises from the very nature of man. Boudin assumes that man may be, quote, depended upon to make a moral issue of and lead a crusade against anything that will stand in the way of his economic progress, end quote. Boudin. The ontological assumption allows Boudin to adopt the general statements on contradiction from Volume 1 of Marx's Capital without specifying the historical conditions for proletarian revolution. The, quote, purely economic, mechanical, end quote, causes of breakdown can then be combined with causes arising, quote, from the, quote, moral, sorry, that's not, let me repeat that. The, quote, purely economico-mechanical, end quote, causes of breakdown can then be combined with causes arising from the, quote, moral nature, end quote, of the proletariat as an active and decisive historical agent. The famous passage from Capital Volume 1, Boudin argues, does not describe two separate movements in the breakdown of capitalism, but, quote, one process, end quote, containing both the, quote, economic conditions and the psychological effects which these conditions produce upon the working man, end quote, effects which guarantee that revolution will occur. Boudin concludes with an ambiguous statement that mixes the, quote, economico-mechanical, end quote, causes of breakdown with the equally deterministic, quote, sociological or, quote, moral causes of breakdown in a way which undermines any further distinction between the two. Quote, while the facts themselves which will lead to the displacement of the capitalist system must be strictly economic in their nature, that is to say that the capitalist mode of production and distribution must become a fetter upon production before it can be overthrown, the actual power which will overthrow it, or at least the form which this will assume in the consciousness of the men who will do this work, may be of a moral or ethical character, end quote. Boudin. However, Boudin then claims that the full development of the contradictions of capitalism and the actual occurrence of social revolution may be precluded by breakdown arising from yet another source. He argues that consumer goods under consumption crises will increase in severity as exploitation intensifies. Surplus consumer goods will, quote, clog with the wheels of production and bring the whole economic machinery of society to a stop, end quote. Boudin. Underconsumption cannot be counteracted. Boudin continues, by the absorption of workers into means of production industries or by an increase in capitalist class consumption, as the revisionists had claimed. However, Boudin later states that the underconsumption crises are not the cause of breakdown, but only symptoms of the decaying capitalist order. The question of the causal force of underconsumption crises is never resolved in the text as Boudin wavers between a sharp distinction between crises and breakdown and none at all. Boudin insists throughout the book, Theoretical System, that the breakdown of capitalism is inevitable and imminent. Although Boudin perceives several changes in capitalism, Boudin consistently refutes the revisionist position that these changes counteract the contradictions of capitalism and necessitate a reformulation of Marxist theory. Imperialism, an extension of capitalist policy, can prolong the decline of the economy, but cannot cancel the effects of underconsumption, since foreign markets soon begin to produce the consumer goods they once absorbed. Waste, the, quote, safety valve of capitalism, end quote, absorbs surplus and may delay collapse, but cannot diminish the long-run effects of accumulation. Boudin concludes that, quote, it is on waste that the capitalist system now depends for the continuance of the capitalist system's existence, end quote. Boudin. Even if it could be demonstrated that the economic conditions for collapse have been mitigated, Boudin continues, the, quote, Marxian philosophy does not require the arrival at an economic impossibility, end quote, but only a state of fettered production before a proletariat revolution becomes the inevitable impetus to collapse. Capitalism in its fettered state is a system which, quote, has become historically impossible, even though mechanically it may still be possible, end quote. Boudin. The, quote, economic and, quote, moral causes of breakdown that Boudin merges in his earlier discussion are once again separated. Caught within the terms of the revisionist debate, Boudin incorporates the moral imperatives introduced by Bernstein and the economic imperatives defended by Kautsky, but understandably is unable to accommodate both within a coherent logical argument. Boudin was never seriously tempted to rethink his commitment to the concept of economic primacy. A decade after Theoretical System appeared, Boudin again turned to the problem of breakdown in his book Socialism and War, published in 1916. Although Boudin discusses imperialism in a way that clearly indicates the need for a reconsideration of the theory of structural and superstructural formations, Boudin retains his original theory of capitalist development. Boudin argues that the involvement of the state in economic affairs is a, quote, physical necessity, end quote, endorsed through the creation of an ethical imperative. Imperialism, Boudin argues, is possible only by virtue of the existence of ideological forces that convert foreign involvements into issues of, quote, individual morality, end quote. Boudin. Boudin's ontological argument about the inevitability of revolution as a moral response to oppression is part of Boudin's attempt to undermine revisionist claims concerning a change in the objective conditions of capitalism. If the idea of mechanical collapse no longer gained wide acceptance, the inevitability of an ontological law could provide irrefutable proof of the imminent end of the system. Unwittingly, Boudin adopted Bernstein's idea of socialism as a moral rather than economic necessity, and further wrote of the analysis of class as an integral part of the analysis of objective conditions. When the radical wing of the American Socialist Party broke to form the Communist Party in 1919, Boudin did not follow. After the crash of 1929 and the Second Great Depression failed to bring down capitalism or to elicit the, quote, moral response that Boudin thought inevitable, Boudin left the socialist movement entirely. The best theoretical mind of the Socialist Party had been squandered on the revisionist debates, and ultimately became a captive of the same political assumptions that left Western Marxism in ruins on the continent. One moment. New section, Anti-Orthodox Beginnings. Veblen's writings on capitalism, published during the same period as Boudin's works, were part of his attempt to redefine the discipline of economics. Veblen discounts the marginalist school as theoretically misguided and criticizes classical political economy for its narrow approach to economic problems. Classical political economy, Veblen argues, cannot develop a concept of, quote, evolutionary economics, end quote, because classical political economy lacks an understanding of anthropology. Quote, evolution, for Veblen, however, did not carry the same connotations of gradual self-propelled social reform that the term carried for Bernstein, or the meaning of deterministic laws progressively realized that Kautsky adopted. Veblen recognized in clear and explicit terms that Darwinism had displaced Marx's theory of history in the hands of the revisionists and orthodox Marxists, and took a critical position against this reformulation. Footnote, see Veblen's article, The Socialist Economics of Karl Marx, available in the portable Veblen. Veblen's commitment to a, quote, evolutionary and anthropological formulation of economic problems eventually provides Veblen's work with a model that closely resembles Marx's structure/superstructure scheme. Evolutionary economics, Veblen writes, quote, must be the theory of a process of cultural growth as determined by the economic interest, a theory of a cumulative sequence of economic institutions stated in terms of the process itself, end quote. Veblen, however, was not committed to the concept of economic primacy, and indicates that the relationship between structure and superstructure is one of interaction and mutual determination. Economic life, Veblen says, quote, affects the cultural structure of all points, at all points, so that all institutions may be said to be in some measure economic institutions. This is necessarily the case since the base of action, the point of departure, at any step in the process is the entire organic complex of habits of thought that have been shaped by past processes, end quote. Veblen, in the article, Why Economics is Not an Evolutionary Science. Veblen's willingness to rethink the relationship between structure and superstructure led Veblen to reformulate Marx's theory of capitalist development in anti-orthodox terms. Veblen's theory of the breakdown of capitalism appears in the book The Theory of Business Enterprise, written in 1904, long after he had completed his study of Marx. In this work, The Theory of Business Enterprise, Veblen distinguishes between crises which occur as part of the business cycle and depressions which do not necessarily follow a cyclical pattern. Both are linked to profit rates. According to Veblen, crises are, quote, periods of price disturbance, end quote, inherent in capitalist economies. But no, quote, tenable theory, end quote, of these crises has been produced because, quote, it has been customary to approach the problem from the side of the industrial phenomena involved, the mechanical facts of production and consumption, rather than from the side of business enterprise, the phenomena of prices, earnings, and capitalization, end quote. Veblen, The Theory of Business Enterprise. Veblen contends that crises are preceded by periods of prosperity, marked by rising prices and high profit rates and caused by progressive demand and decreases or relatively slow increases in the cost of production. Investments made during periods of prosperity are financed on the prospect of increased profit rates. Veblen argues that, quote, in the ordinary course, however, the necessary expenses of production presently overtake or nearly overtake the prospective selling price of the output, end quote. Veblen, The Theory of Business Enterprise. Profit rates then begin to fall. At this point in the economic cycle, quote, the enhanced capitalization based on enhanced putative earnings proves greater than the earnings realized, end quote, and a drastic readjustment of values follows. A crisis then represents the discrepancy between the value of projected and effective capital as shown through profit rates. The onset of a crisis is marked by a falling rate of profit, followed by, quote, liquidation, cancelment of credits, high discount rates, falling prices, and, quote, forced sales, end quote, and shrinkage of values, end quote. Veblen. And a subsequent decrease in existing capital and capital investments. The concentration of capital is increased as the result of defaulted loans and reduced credit. Veblen claims that prior to the 1880s, crises normally were followed by a renewal of prosperity, stimulated by increased demand in one sector of the economy. But Veblen, like Engels, argues that capitalism underwent a fundamental transformation in the last quarter of the 19th century, and that the business cycle no longer followed a stable pattern of inflation, crisis, and recovery. Instead, the post-1880 period of capitalist development is marked by a tendency towards what Veblen calls, quote, chronic depression, end quote, or the consistent divergence of capitalization and profit rates. After 1880, quote, the advancing efficiency and articulation of the process of the machine industry reached such a pitch that the cost of production of productive goods has since then persistently outstripped such readjustment of capitalization as has from time to time been made. The persistent decline of profits due to this relative overproduction of industrial apparatus has no permitted or consistent speculative expansion of the kind which abounds in the earlier half of the 19th century to get underway." End quote. Veblen, The Theory of Business Enterprise. The increasing efficiency of the production process, represented by the increase of constant capital over variable capital, results in a chronic depression, which is, quote, "normal to business under the fully developed regime of the machine industry," end quote. Veblen, Theory of the Business Enterprise. Chronic depression displaces cyclical crises. Economic development is detemporalized. Veblen argues that the only remedy to chronic depression is to restore the rate of profit to a level above the rate of interest through direct control over output and price levels. This control can be exerted through the formation of trust or, quote, "thoroughgoing coalition in those lines of business in which coalition is practicable," end quote. Veblen. Veblen does not indicate that the chronic depression will end in the economic breakdown of capitalism, but simply implies that a state of repetition has been reached in capitalist development. Since coalition is possible in the, quote, "greater part of those lines of industry which are dominated by the machine process, it seems reasonable to expect that the remedy should be efficacious." According to Veblen, then, the breakdown of capitalism will not be caused by a mechanical failure in the economic sphere. Instead, capitalism is ultimately threatened by a structural contradiction that manifests itself in superstructural forms. The consequences of the transformation of capitalism that occurred in the last quarter of the 19th century, Veblen argues, go far beyond the onset of chronic depression in the economic realm. The transformation also affected a fundamental change in the political realm and altered the relationship between structural and superstructural forces. Consequently, a new conception of economic breakdown is required. In an attempt to respond to this requirement, Veblen recounts the development of the political order during the pre-capitalist and liberal capitalist eras. In pre-capitalist societies, Veblen claims, the state was, quote, "an organization for the control of affairs in the interest of princely or dynastic ends," end quote. Veblen, preoccupied with, quote, "dynastic prestige and security," end quote, and legitimized by direct appeals to political lineages and loyalty. In those societies, the economic order was subsumed under and supported by the political hierarchy and its traditional forms of legitimation. Since the advent of liberal capitalism, however, constitutional governments have replaced dynastic governments, and, quote, "business ends have taken the lead of dynastic ends in statecraft," end quote. Constitutional government and liberal capitalism developed simultaneously, and both sought legitimation in the concept of natural rights and the ideology of equal exchange that grew out of the natural rights concepts. Their legitimation was buttressed by, quote, "institutional survivals," end quote, from the pre-capitalist era, in the form of the ideologies of patriotism and private property. But, Veblen continues, liberal capitalism rests on the machine process as the primary force of production, a process that facilitates certain, quote, "habits of mind," end quote. And these, quote, "habits" are ultimately incompatible with the legitimating the ideologies of the economic system. According to Veblen, the machine process that serves as the basis of industry and engages large sectors of the population inculcates a belief in, quote, impersonal cause and effect, end quote, and technical forms of rationality. The mental, quote, discipline and, quote, habits of mind, end quote, associated with the machine process are further manifested in the growth of science, which is, quote, single-minded in its pursuit of impersonal relations, of causal sequence in the phenomena with which it is occupied, end quote, and fully contained within, quote, lines marked out by technological thinking, end quote. This technical rationality, induced by contact with modern industrial science and technology, is fundamentally at odds with the legitimating ideologies of the economic order, the sovereignty of private property under natural rights, liberal values and the laws of civil society. Bourgeois governments and the capitalist economies that support them are thus threatened by a contradiction within their own borders. This contradiction, arising from the machine process itself, is manifested in the socialist movement, which Veblen describes as, quote, an animus of dissent from received traditions, end quote. Veblen, Theory of Business Enterprise. Where I leave off. The discipline of machine technology is, quote, peculiarly designed to inculcate such iconoclastic habits of thought as come to a head in the socialistic bias, end quote. Veblen, Theory of the Business Enterprise. The socialist challenge to capitalism represents a growing disloyalty to the natural rights philosophy and other antiquated institutions, and a, quote, demand for organization on industrial as contrasted with business lines, end quote. Veblen claims that the socialist movement, originally seduced by the natural rights philosophy, moved into a fully scientific position by the end of the 19th century. Within the socialist movement, Veblen argues, quote, the claim to the full product of labor, has gradually fallen into abeyance, end quote, and has been replaced by a commitment to complete worker control over the industrial system and the government it supports. According to Veblen, the machine process is both the foundation of industry and a force that cuts away the institutional basis of the very system that industry is intended to serve. A further complication arises with the transformation of capitalism into a system hounded by chronic depression. A system must fight for markets and armaments expenditures, develops warlike tendencies which have an enormous impact on bourgeois governments. Persistent preparations for and engagements in warfare generates militaristic ideological forces which, with their emphases on authority and subordination, counteract the growth of technical rationality. The ideological forces associated with warfare, however, do not constitute a return to the natural rights system of legitimation, but a reversion to the dynastic forms that preceded the liberal capitalist constitutional state. Veblen claims that the future may lie in, quote, dynastic politics, and armament again played to a finish in popular squalor, aristocratic virtues, and universal bankruptcy, end quote. Veblen. This reversion would not be truly, quote, reactionary, but would contain and carry with it an inescapable measure of the technical rationality inherent in the experience of the machine process. In this sense, it would be, quote, less closely bound by authentic conventions, end quote, and would constitute a historical movement of repetition and difference rather than a new order. According to Veblen, then, capitalism generates and is subsequently threatened by two competing ideological or, quote, cultural tendencies, both of which stand in direct opposition to the continuation of the economic system under its present form of legitimation. Veblen determines that, quote, modern technology has, in a manner, cut away the ground of which it first grew and from which it gathered force to reshape the course of history, end quote. Veblen ends the theory of business enterprise with a statement that anticipates in a cautious way the collapse of the capitalist system, it seems possible to say this much, that the full dominion of business enterprise is necessarily a transitory dominion. It stands to lose in the end whether the one or the other of the two divergent cultural tendencies wins, because it is incompatible with the ascendancy of either. End quote. Veblen. The theory of business enterprise. This statement contains the crux of Veblen's concept of breakdown and represents the full meaning of his well-known prophecy that the future lies in socialism or barbarism, a prophecy that originated in Engels. When the conceptual context of this prophecy is understood, the resonance between the works of Veblen and Marx becomes unmistakably apparent, and the extent to which Veblen's explicit interpretation of Marx conceals this underlying resonance becomes clear. Veblen's concept of chronic depression is the result of an inherent tendency toward a rising organic composition of capital and a subsequent decrease in profit rates duplicates both Marx's concept of the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Let me repeat that. Veblen's concept of chronic depression is the result of an inherent tendency towards a rising organic composition of capital and a subsequent decrease in profit rates duplicates Marx's concept of the tendency of a falling rate of profit. Both theorists claim that the decline in profit rates is an inherent part of capitalist economies, the economic consequence of technological advancement. Both argue that the decline in profit rates can be counteracted through an increase in market size and control, achieved through monopolization and imperialism. Both indicate that the process of effect and counter-effect in profit rates need not result in a decisive economic disequilibrium. The points of similarity between the two arguments extend to detail. But despite these similarities and duplications, Veblen explicitly rejects Marx's concept of a falling rate of profit, claiming that Marx shared with Tugendbaranovsky the classical fallacy of viewing capitalism as the, quote, mechanical facts of production and consumption, end quote, rather than the, quote, the phenomena of price, earnings, and capitalization, end quote. Veblen. Veblen then accuses Marx of the same empiricist failing that Marx had laid at the door of classical political economy when he denounced Smith and Ricardo for mistaking the material facts of capital for its laws. In Veblen's reading of Marx, the discourse of the open dialectics is lost in the shift from empirical to general analysis that marks many parts of Marx's Capital. Veblen locates a positivistic voice in Capital Volume 1 and then carries it over into his reading of Volume 3, where it is used to obliterate Marx's concept of the falling rate of profit. As Paul Sweezy notes, Veblen's writings on Marx are based on a, quote, knowledge of the literature of Marxism, which is so far ahead of that of anything of his contemporaries in the U.S. that there is simply no ground for comparison, end quote. In his most extended critique of Marx, Veblen argues that Marx's system of thought, quote, differs characteristically from all systems of theory that have preceded it, both in its premises and in its aims, end quote. Veblen. According to Veblen, however, Marx remains the captive of materialistic Hegelianism, combined with a natural rights philosophy and British utilitarianism. Marx adopts a dialectical vision of history from the classical... where did I miss that? I fucked up. Marx adopts a dialectical vision of history from Hegel and a modified version of the labor theory of value from the classical political economist. This modification, Veblen argues, occurs in Marx's rejection of Ricardo's reliance on the repugnancy of labor as a measure of labor's value, which has prevented Ricardo from recognizing and calculating surplus value. Veblen concludes that Marx's labor theory of value is, quote, self-evident, quote, and not subject to the marginalist critique waged by Bumbaverk. The theory of surplus value allows Marx to pursue the problem of accumulation and to rightfully reject the underconsumptionist theory of crises and breakdown. Veblen finds that Marx's theory of capitalist development and the transitory character of capitalism rests on his notion of inevitable increases in unemployment due to technological advancement and the inevitable response of the proletariat to unemployment and low wages. His reading of Marx's theory of development relies entirely on Volume 1, where Marx links social revolution to the economic contradictions of capitalism. Veblen explicitly turns away from the second and third volumes of Marx's Capital, simply stating that, quote, they add nothing essential, although many of the details of the processes concerned in the working out of the capitalist scheme are treated with greater fullness, and the analysis is carried out with greater consistency and with admirable results, end quote. Veblen. Marx's concept of the falling rate of profit and the open dialectic of the discourse on the falling rate of profit never surface in Veblen's discussion. The theory of development that Veblen takes from Marx's Capital Volume 1 is then dismissed as inaccurate, along with its, quote, Hegelian philosophical postulates. Veblen concludes that Marx's theory suffers from a, quote, romantic and, quote, vision of final resolution through class conflict. In his most concentrated and conclusive consideration of Marx, Veblen privileges the Hegelian content of Marx's general statements on contradiction and silences the discourse on profits in Volume 3. Veblen was not unfamiliar with Volume 3, however, and had written a, quote, note for the Journal of Political Economy when the volume appeared in 1894. The article does not discuss Marx's concept of a falling rate of profit, but simply attempts to defend Marx's theory of surplus value against those critics who had refuted it through empirical research on profit rates. Veblen correctly argues that the rate of surplus value cannot be identified with the rate of profit, but does not move past this important but limited discussion of Volume 3. What might have been a crucial point of theoretical recognition is lost to a technical corrective. Veblen places his own analysis of capitalist development, with its emphasis on superstructural rather than structural primacy, beyond the theoretical reach of Marx's Capital. In the process, Veblen obscures the meaning of Marx's text and the nature of his own intellectual context. The unfailing and highly systematic misreading of Marx that occurs in his works belies the tension that exists between his thought and Marx's theories. Veblen's primary concern throughout his studies of capitalism revolves around the process of abstraction through which economic symbols are reified and distorted. His analysis of animism, central to so much of his work, closely parallels Marx's analysis of commodity fetishism. Both analyses provide a basis for a critique of ideology that is grounded in an understanding of the particular processes of signification arising from the economic realm. Similarly, Veblen's critique of classical political economy closely follows the critique formulated in Marx's theories of surplus value. Both Veblen and Marx reject the process of abstraction involved in the construction of economic ideal types, and both reject the naturalistic and animistic metaphors employed in classical explanations of economic development. Moreover, both Veblen and Marx attempt to ensure their escape from classical categories through the use of structural rather than linear or teleological concepts of causality, and through the use of a parodic prose style. As has been noted, however, Veblen's interpretation of Marx emphasizes the Hegelian content of Marx's Capital and leads Veblen to distinguish between his own, quote, institutional perspective and Marx's, quote, romantic views. Veblen situates his break from Marx in his discovery of these Hegelian residues and the, quote, metaphysical shadows cast across Marx's Capital. The Hegelian context he discovers and exaggerates in Marx, however, reappears in his own works at exactly those points where his thought diverges most sharply from that of Marx. In Veblen's theory of the instinct of workmanship, Veblen introduces into his work an anthropological component of precisely the type that Marx expelled from his own when he formalized his break from Hegel in Marx's Capital. Veblen's concept of an instinct of workmanship functions as the site where the objective and normative aspects of Veblen's social theory explicitly overlap. The point of overlap is established through the postulation of an anthropological a priori, which falls into a Hegelian framework. This framework was rejected by Marx in his later works and normatively displaced by the concept of surplus value in Marx's Capital. Veblen attempts to dissociate his own theory of capitalist development from Marx through a misdirected critique of Hegelianism. In the process, he falls into an appropriation of Hegelian forms. Consequently, his critique of Marx effaces itself. Veblen's theory suffers, and the intellectual history of theories of breakdown is once again obscured by a series of unrealized intentions and contextual evasions. New section, Neo-orthodoxy and the Second Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. The cyclical crises and preparations for war that provided the context for Veblen's works were replaced by unprecedented prosperity and civilian sector growth in the United States economy throughout the 1922 to 29 period. The successful suppression of the proletarian revolutions in Europe at the beginning of the decade was followed by rapid increases in industrial production, productivity, and the level of trade across the continent. Once again, theories of breakdown seemed misplaced. But Reconstruction had not fully resolved the economic instability created by World War I. War debts and reparations caused disequilibrium in international payments, and protectionism exacerbated trade imbalances. New technologies and new lands brought under production during the war induced relative world overproduction in agriculture and depressed farm prices. When the Second Great Depression occurred, the United States economy fell first, followed by France and England, and to an even greater degree, Germany. The stock market crash in October 1929 and the unchecked downward trend that continued until 1933 offered a new opportunity for the revitalization of breakdown theories. In the 4 years between 1929 and 1933, United States industrial production contracted by 1/2 and wholesale prices fell by 1/3. Investment plummeted, the value of trade products collapsed, and bankruptcies rose to record rates. Conservative estimates placed unemployment at 14 million by March of 1933. The Depression inspired a flood of writings on crises and collapse. The most influential Marxist analysis of the crash to appear in the United States was a book called The Decline of American Capitalism by Louis Freina. Let's say Freina just because. Louis Freina wrote Decline in 1934 under the name of Louis Corey, an alias assumed by Freina when he formalized his break with the Communist Party. In the first decades of the century, Corey had worked closely with Boudin in the journal New Review and was an editor of a series of American Socialist Party publications, including The Internationalist, Class Struggle, Revolutionary Age, and The Communist. Louis Freina also directed the American Bolshevik Bureau of Information, founded in 1918, and edited Lenin's and Trotsky's Proletarian Revolution in Russia. The Decline of American Capitalism the book, quickly won the praise of the Communist Party and gained acceptance in popular circles, and Corey was asked to rejoin the CPUSA. Instead, he aligned himself with the expelled Lovestonites and gradually moved toward democratic socialism. Throughout this period, Corey maintained his claim to orthodox Marxism. The decline of American capitalism was the most complete study in the new genre of crisis studies in the United States after the crash of 1929, and the most influential Marxist analysis of the Depression. The decline of American capitalism is a massive history of American capitalism since the Civil War, with emphasis placed on the prosperity of the 20s and the ensuing Depression. Lewis Corey relies heavily on detailed statistical reports concerning the development of corporate holdings. Unlike Boudin, Corey does not enter into a dialogue with the European theorists of the time. Behind the constant theoretical references to Marx and infrequent references to Lenin, Corey's writings are most clearly situated in a distinctly American context of economic and political commentary. Lewis Corey's antagonists are not the European revisionists, but the American apologists. Writers like Luxemburg and Grossman, who might have been cited as sources for Corey's position, are passed over in favor of American writers like Frederick Jackson Turner, Charles Beard, Walter Lippmann, and Brooks Adams. Wikipedia says Frederick Jackson Turner lived from 1861 to 1932. Frederick Jackson Turner was an American historian during the early 20th century, based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison until 1910, and then Harvard University. Frederick Jackson Turner was known primarily for his frontier thesis. Frederick Jackson Turner trained many PhDs who went on to become well-known historians. Frederick Jackson Turner promoted interdisciplinary and quantitative methods, often with an emphasis on the Midwestern United States. Frederick Jackson Turner's essay titled "The Significance of the Frontier in American History" included ideas that formed the frontier thesis. In the essay, "The Significance of the Frontier in American History," Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the moving western frontier exerted a strong influence on American democracy and the American character from the colonial era until 1890. Frederick Jackson Turner is also known for his theories of geographical sectionalism. During recent years, historians and academics have argued frequently over Turner's work. However, all agree that the frontier thesis has had an enormous effect on historical scholarship. So that's Frederick Jackson Turner. Wikipedia says Charles A. Beard lived from 1874 to 1948 and was an American historian and professor who wrote primarily during the first half of the 20th century. A history professor at Columbia University, Charles A. Beard's influence is primarily due to Charles A. Beard's publications in the fields of history and political science. Charles A. Beard's works include a radical evaluation of the founding fathers of the United States, whom Charles A. Beard believed to be more motivated by economics than by philosophical principles. Charles A. Beard's most influential work, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, published in 1913, has been the subject of great controversy ever since its publication. While An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States has been frequently criticized for its methodology and conclusions, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States was responsible for a wide-ranging reinterpretation of early American history. An icon of the progressive school of historical interpretation, Charles A. Beard's reputation suffered during the Cold War when analyses of economic class conflict were dropped by most United States historians. The consensus historian Richard Hofstadter concluded in 1968, quote, "Today Beard's reputation stands like an imposing ruin in the landscape of American historiography. What was once the grandest house in the province is now a ravaged survival," end quote. Richard Hofstadter. The end of Cold War anti-communism has rekindled scholarly interest in Charles A. Beard's historical methods and findings, particularly Charles A. Beard's later work on the domestic economic origins of U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century. Back to the text. Wikipedia says Walter Lippmann lived from 1889 to 1974 and was an American writer, reporter, and political commentator. With a career spanning 60 years, Walter Lippmann is famous for being among the first to introduce the concept of the Cold War, coining the term, quote, stereotype in the modern psychological meaning, as well as critiquing media and democracy in his newspaper column and several books, most notably his 1922 book, Public Opinion. Walter Lippmann also played a notable role as research director of Woodrow Wilson's post-World War I Board of Inquiry. Walter Lippmann's views on the role of journalism in democracy were contrasted with the contemporaneous writings of John Dewey in what has been retrospectively named the Lippmann-Dewey debate. Walter Lippmann won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for his syndicated newspaper column Today and Tomorrow, and for his 1961 interview of Nikita Khrushchev. Walter Lippmann has been highly praised with titles ranging from, quote, most influential journalist of the 20th century to, quote, father of modern journalism. Michael Schudson writes that James W. Carey considered Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, as, quote, the founding book of modern journalism, end quote, and also, quote, the founding book in American media studies, end quote. James W. Carey. Brooks Adams lived from 1848 to 1927 and was an American attorney, historian, political scientist, and a critic of capitalism. Back to the text. Corey's purpose is not to extend the theoretical discussion of the fate of capitalism, but to study the development of the Depression of the 1930s, and in doing so to provide support for Marx's analysis of capitalism. Corey writes, quote, precisely because it is the most highly developed, American industry offers the fullest confirmation of the analysis Karl Marx made of the laws of capitalist production. It is one of the tasks of this book, using the American statistical material, the most abundant in the world, to make a quantitative as well as a qualitative demonstration of the Marxist conception of the fundamental aspects of capitalism. End quote. Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. Marx is presented throughout the text. Lewis Corey does not rely on the entire corpus of Marx's writing, however, but draws almost exclusively from Capital Volume 3 and from those passages from Volumes 1 and 2 that relate to Marx's theory of crises. The tone of The Decline of American Capitalism is not the apocalyptical tone that reaches its full force in Corey's later Crisis of the Middle Class, but a reasoned and deterministic discussion of profits taken from Capital Volume 3. Lewis Corey begins by distinguishing the cyclical crises of a growing capitalist order from the permanent stagnation that Lewis Corey claims characterizes the post-1929 period. Lewis Corey concludes, however, by reinstituting the cyclical pattern in a passage that resembles the indeterminate theory of Volume 3, quote, the decline and decay of capitalism the decline and decay of capitalism do not exclude a revival of prosperity. For the cyclical movement goes on and contradictions are still, quote, solved by the alternation of prosperity and depression, but on a lower level, prosperity is more incomplete than formerly, accompanied by limitation of production and disemployment, developing swiftly toward a new crisis, while depression is more prolonged and grinding. End quote. Lewis Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. This passage does not anticipate final and complete breakdown or restoration of a strong capitalist economy. Instead, Corey argues that the, quote, tendency is toward a condition of chronic depression interrupted by fitful revivals of prosperity, end quote, in a cyclical pattern which is, quote, an aspect of decline and not of growth, end quote. This conclusion is reached after a long discussion of the transition from the industrial capitalism of the 19th century to the state capitalism of the 20th. The transition is marked by a shift from cyclical growth to the cyclical decline that Corey describes as the fate of state capitalism. The state capitalism of the Depression era is characterized by the, quote, exhaustion of capitalism as a progressive economic force, end quote, and the inability of the system to reverse a downward trend toward permanent stagnation. The Depression serves as Corey's evidence that the decline of capitalism has begun. Decline is not synonymous with breakdown, but constitutes a necessary preliminary to the collapse of the system as a whole. Quote, decline is not collapse. The decline of capitalism does not mean that the economic order is unable to function, but that it must function on a lower level. It does not mean an inability to restore production and prosperity, but an inability to restore them on any considerable scale. While the decline may be interrupted, the downward movement will persist, end quote. Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. Decline is characterized by international disturbances, instability, permanent unemployment, and the social ills which, in the book, The Crisis of the Middle Class by Corey, threatens to bring down the system. According to Lewis Corey, decline is inherent and inevitable due to the nature of accumulation and the inability to expand accumulation over time. It is, quote, determined by the high development of the productive forces and the relative exhaustion of the long-time factors of expansion, end quote. Lewis Corey. Decline is the dominant force in the, quote, perpetual struggle between the forces of expansion and decline, end quote, which marks the capitalist system and arises from three contradictions within capitalism itself. The first two contradictions are the fundamental causes of the cyclical crises that occur in the industrial phase of capitalist development. The third is responsible for the permanent decline that characterizes state capitalism. The first contradiction is manifested in the overproduction of means of production goods arising from the profit motive and the tendency towards excessive accumulation of capital, which limits outlets for profitable investment and creates profit realization problems. The second contradiction is manifested in the overproduction of consumer goods arising from the tendency to develop the forces of production beyond the potential for consumption and resulting in a standard underconsumption crisis in the realization of profits. This contradiction, Corey notes, is the most common cause of periodic crises during the industrial phase. The third contradiction of capitalism is the cause of non-cyclical decline and the state intervention in the economy that decline inspires. This contradiction is manifested in a falling rate of profit that cannot be overcome through continued expansion of markets. The problems of overproduction and underconsumption that arise during the industrial phase of capitalism can be counteracted through increased consumption stimulated by the expansion of markets, so that the crises are relative, temporary, and cyclical in occurrence. However, with the exhaustion of markets, quote, the limits to the development of capitalist production and prosperity become absolute, end quote. Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. State intervention, monopolization, and imperialism are all responses to this exhaustion of markets and the ensuing fall in profits. But these forces, Corey indicates, cannot postpone the movement towards permanent and unrelieved stagnation for an indefinite period of time. Corey concludes that, quote, where industrial capitalism was identified with economic progress and upswing, monopoly capitalism is identified with retrogression and decline, end quote. Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. In order for the capitalist system to survive, Lewis Corey argues, quote, capitalist production must yield profits, and these profits must be converted into capital by means of increasing output and absorption of capital goods, end quote. Lewis Corey, The Decline of American Capitalism. As the possibilities for expansion are exhausted, as domestic and foreign markets are saturated, the compensatory force that fights the tendency towards falling rates of profit is lost. Corey adopts the formulation of this contradiction found in Capital Volume 3 as the basis for his theory of decline and breakdown, and the theoretical grounding for the book The Decline of American Capitalism. According to Corey, the tendency for the organic composition of capital to increase is the, quote, basic objective factor in the contradictions of accumulation, end quote, which yields to falling rates of profit that are not always offset by a sufficiently significant rise in the mass of profit. Like Grossman, who was writing in Germany during the same years that Corey produced The Decline of American Capitalism, Lewis Corey finds that the falling rate of profit is the central tendency in the contradictions of capitalism that threatens the continuation of the system. Lewis Corey determines that, quote, capitalist production is an unceasing struggle against the tendency, end quote. The falling rate of profit, however, is not absolute and may be checked primarily through increases in mass stimulated by increased consumption. The exhaustion of expansion that occurs under monopoly capitalism may indicate an inability to counteract the tendency. Corey links the persistent problem of underconsumption with the disruption of counteraction. For Corey, the falling rate of profit is tied to underconsumption through the decrease in employment that follows increases in the organic composition of capital. The falling rate of profit, then, which Marx had pursued in the realm of production alone and did not formulate in cyclical terms, is linked to consumption and combined with the theory of cyclical crises in Corey's The Decline of American Capitalism. Despite his constant references to Marx's Capital Volume 3 and Corey's claims to orthodoxy, Corey essentially rewrites profit theory to enlarge its theoretical scope. In 1935, 1 year after the appearance of The Decline of American Capitalism, Corey publishes The Crisis of the Middle Class, a book which forms a logical, if somewhat extreme, extension of Corey's earlier arguments. The Decline of American Capitalism is cited throughout The Crisis of the Middle Class and provides the primary reference for the crisis of the middle class. Other references, including those made to Marx, are largely rhetorical. The Crisis of the Middle Class does not draw from the statistical material included in The Decline of American Capitalism, nor does the Crisis of the Middle Class attempt to provide a detailed empirical analysis of events. Instead, in Crisis of the Middle Class, Corey shifts into a self-referential and speculative general analysis of the ideological and political effects of state capitalism. With this new self-referentiality and this new focus on the superstructural manifestations of a declining economy, Corey moves to the brink of an apocalyptical vision based on an anti-orthodox interpretation of crisis and breakdown. The world, Corey claims, in The Crisis of the Middle Class is in, quote, critical condition, end quote, threatened by, quote, the death of civilization itself, end quote. This state of affairs, he argues, is the superstructural result of the economic decline and decay outlined in his earlier writings. In Crisis, Corey reiterates the idea that decline has become a permanent part of capitalism. The state capitalism of the 20th century is marked by, quote, an absolute limitation of capitalist production and accumulation in terms of increasing profits and their conversion into capital. Capitalism is strangled by its objective economic limits and must decline and decay. It is the crisis and breakdown of the system. End quote. Corey, the crisis of the middle class. The economic transition from growth under 19th century industrial capitalism to decline under 20th century state capitalism, presented in Corey's The Decline of American Capitalism, is reformulated as a series of political, social, and ideological transformations in The Crisis of the Middle Class. Corey locates the point of transformation in the progressive era, when continued monopolization and consolidation resulted in a decrease in the number of middle-class property owners and an increase in the number of middle-class salaried employees. According to Lewis Corey, the presence of this, quote, new middle class, end quote, of employees produces a, quote, split personality, end quote, within the middle class as a whole and induces a, quote, crisis of the middle class, end quote. The petty bourgeois property owners are left to maintain the liberal values of economic individualism that characterized the 19th century. These values conflict with those of the new middle class of salaried employees who identify with corporate management and represent, quote, the dominant system of economic collectivism, end quote. The monopolies of state capitalism. The, quote, new middle class, which increasingly displaces the old middle class of the industrial phase, operates under a set of values that displace 19th century commitments to liberty, democracy, and equality of opportunity. The new values, Corey writes, consist of, quote, the identification of democracy and middle-class interest with the acceptance of a, quote, regulated monopoly, a state capitalism dependent on bureaucracy and caste, and an aggressive nationalism and imperialism. The identification of democracy and middle-class interest with the acceptance of, quote, regulated monopoly, a state capitalism dependent on bureaucracy and caste, and an aggressive nationalism and imperialism. Petty bourgeois democracy was reacting against itself, end quote. Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. According to Corey, then, state capitalism is characterized by superstructural forms that destroy the liberal values of the industrial phase and revert back to the pre-capitalist values of status, hierarchy, and militarism. This ideological transformation is represented by the rise of fascism in Europe and in the United States. Quote, fascism, Corey argues, is the, quote, last desperate resort of capitalism to maintain its rule, end quote. And, quote, openly seeks inspiration in the medieval ideals out of the destruction of which modern civilization arose, end quote. Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. The reversion back to feudal values constitutes a, quote, new barbarism, end quote, a superstructural response to a declining economy which threatens to destroy the civilized world. Fascism may prevent a socialist revolution from overthrowing the capitalist system, Corey argues, but it cannot save the system from continued decline and, quote, eventual collapse, for no national economy can indefinitely exist on such a program, end quote. Lewis Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. The Crisis of the Middle Class, however, provides no explanation of the imperative behind Corey's argument for continued economic decline. The astute and insightful analysis of the ideological transformation that accompanies the transition from 19th century industrial capitalism to 20th century state capitalism is marred by a theoretical silence on the issue of causality. In The Crisis of the Middle Class, Lewis Corey's superstructural analyses are replete with assumptions concerning causal forces in history. At those points in the text where theoretical explanations would be appropriate, Corey substitutes simplistic statements on the dialectical, quote, laws of social development as the basis for his belief in the breakdown of the new barbarism. Quote, "The decline of capitalism in its historical aspects is the negative expression of the law of social progress. No society based upon class rule and exploitation is eternal. One social order succeeds another in the upward and onward march of humanity." End quote. Lewis Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. In The Crisis of the Middle Class, the confusion that plagued the economic analysis of breakdown in The Decline of American Capitalism is displaced by silencing the theoretical effort and replacing the theoretical effort with a series of assumptions about the progressive course of history. Moreover, the determinism that fills the theoretical gap is fed by a stylistic shift. The reason to prose of the decline of American capitalism is replaced by a highly metaphorical and graphic depiction of the, quote, "new barbarism," end quote, which will, quote, "consume our blood and bones," end quote. If civilization is to survive, Lewis Corey writes in one of his dramatic passages, quote, "the forces of life must rally against an approaching death," end quote. Lewis Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. In the face of an economic order that is capable of creating only, quote, "reaction and death," end quote. In Crisis, Corey's theory of breakdown shifts from the orthodox position of economic primacy to the anti-orthodox position of superstructural primacy. Lewis Corey's description of the 20th century reversion back to feudal values resonates with Veblen's analysis of the rise of militarism. Corey anticipates the anti-orthodox position when he writes that, quote, "the state is constantly called upon to perform economic functions, to make good the shortcomings of corporate enterprise. It was the state which, in 1933, saved the American economic structure from complete breakdown." End quote. Corey, The Crisis of the Middle Class. However, Lewis Corey does not fully recognize the implications of this shift in Corey's analysis of capitalism, or attempt to reconcile the superstructural focus of The Crisis of the Middle Class with the structural focus of The Decline of American Capitalism. Lewis Corey does not turn back to Marx for guidance or to Veblen for support. The self-referentiality and general level of analysis in The Crisis of the Middle Class limit Corey's theoretical reach. Corey was familiar with Veblen's writings and viewed them favorably. When Corey reviewed a selection of Veblen's essays for the Marxist Quarterly in 1937, he referred to Veblen as, quote, "incomparably the greatest American thinker in the social sciences," end quote. Corey. Veblen and Marxism, published in Marxist Quarterly, 1937. Corey notes Veblen's, quote, "prophecy that the system of business enterprise or capitalism must inevitably decay," end quote, and finds that Veblen offers, quote, "the beginnings of a practical revolutionary approach to the problem of social reconstruction," end quote. Lewis Corey. For these reasons, Veblen, quote, "more than any other American thinker, offers material and ideas of the utmost significance to Marxism," end quote. Lewis Corey. Lewis Corey discusses Veblen's relationship to Marx and rightly concludes that Veblen's critique of Marx arises from Veblen's narrow conception of science, his more thoroughgoing determinism, and his commitment to a concept of human nature. But, Corey argues, Veblen's work compensates for a lack of understanding of superstructural forces among Marxists and offers a necessary corrective to Marx's work on the cultural impact of technology. Corey concludes that, quote, "the value of Veblen's analysis is not destroyed by the fact that he is unaware of the pressure capitalist production exerts through the fetishism of commodities on the recreation of irrationalism," end quote. Lewis Corey. With his crucial combination of Marx and Veblen completed, Corey walks away from any application of the insight contained in this corrective to Veblen's theory of the instinct of workmanship and its bearing on Veblen's theory of breakdown. Veblen's writings draw Corey out of the logical space of neo-orthodox speculation and into a more complex and suggestive line of interpretation. This line of interpretation draws from Marx's concept of commodity fetishism and Veblen's concept of reciprocal social action, concepts which challenge positivist epistemologies and linear, progressive conceptions of history. The confrontation of neo-orthodox and anti-orthodox writings, where it occurs at all, results in a significant, if not entirely self-conscious theoretical reconsideration of the neo-orthodox position. Corey's reconsideration, however, never reached the proportions that would have been necessary to fill the theoretical gaps in his thought. Despite Corey's appreciation of Veblen's emphasis on superstructural forces, and despite Corey's recognition of the potential effects of state intervention in the economy, Corey never moves into a fully anti-orthodox position based on a reversal of structural and superstructural relations. Throughout the decline of American capitalism, Lewis Corey assumes that structural forces are primary in the development in the development and maintenance of capitalism. In Crisis, Veblen turns to a superstructural definition of breakdown, but is unable to provide theoretical support for his claims. Corey does not seem to recognize the enormous implications of the shift from a structural to a superstructural focus between the decline of American capitalism and the crisis of the middle class. Moreover, the crisis of the middle class is far too weak to sustain the theoretical weight of the new position. What might have been fruitful and creative reconsideration of Veblen's anti-orthodoxy and the meaning of, quote, state capitalism, end quote, is lost in the blood imagery of the apocalyptic vision of Crisis, the crisis of the middle class. Corey's theory of breakdown is best compared to Grossman's, with Corey and Grossman's common return to the law of the falling rate of profit. But Lewis Corey's commitment to the concept of economic primacy seems to be the result of a theoretical default rather than the self-conscious determination that Grossman displays in his pursuit of what Grossman considered to be the orthodoxy of the economic approach. Corey caught sight of the anti-orthodox position and turned away from it, not so much from a desire to maintain his neo-orthodox position, but in a long flash of confusion, stimulated by his obsession with impending collapse. The transition from structural analysis in the decline of American capitalism to superstructural analysis in the crisis of the middle class was in some part linked to the growing significance Lewis Corey placed on the rise of fascism. When the crisis of the middle class was written, Corey was confronted by a system that had staggered throughout the financial crisis of 1933 and survived the highest levels of production capacity destruction in history. The threat of mechanical economic collapse was displaced by the threat of full state control and fascism. Corey's faith in the potential for proletarian revolution was diminished a decade earlier during his break with the Communist Party, and further diminished as he turned his attention to ideology and the spread of fascism. In the process, Corey's concept of breakdown was transformed from the neo-orthodoxy of the decline of American capitalism to the tendencies toward anti-orthodoxy examined in the crisis of the middle class, in a movement that resembled the shift in the works of the Frankfurt scholars as they too faced a fascist Europe. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 5 of... Sorry. I don't have the title right in front of me. The Breakdown of Capitalism, A History of the Idea in Western Marxism, 1983 to 1993, by F.R. Hansen. Thank you so much for listening.